Well, good afternoon, everyone. Like Mark said, I'm Theo Kosub with the Public Transportation Division. This is actually my first time to attend the Southwest Rail Conference, so it's been exciting so far. Today, I'm looking forward to talking to you all a little bit about the statewide multimodal transit plan. It was a while in the making. We started this effort back in 2023, and I'm happy to share a little bit about it with you all today. So we're going to look at a couple of topics. Why transit matters to Texas, why we're doing the SMTP right now, an overview of what the transit system looks like here in Texas, some of the highlights of our public outreach and engagement effort. We'll also take a look at some of the important needs, gaps, and challenges we uncovered when we were developing this plan. We'll look at some of the strategies to address those. We'll talk about some of the initial implementation steps that we're already working on within the division. And then we'll wrap up with a call to action. So why multimodal transit? Why do we need options? Well, there are a number of people who prefer alternatives to driving alone in single occupancy vehicles. Transit helps the state thrive. The SMTP 2050 does align with our state long-range transportation plan and the rail plan. It also aligns with a similar effort that was completed in the same time frame, the statewide active transportation plan. And we have a scheme of plans that align to give choice to our residents, but also to help economic development thrive throughout the state. Here's just a couple of interesting facts. Transit powers the economy. DART Light Rail looking at $10 billion in economic impact from 2016 to 2018. Grapevine, you see a revenue increase there for those businesses within a 5-minute walk. The McCullough transit station there in Austin by Q2 Stadium, it's making a huge impact, recently completed. A little bit more about jobs. So, transit is not only a savings mechanism that if you look at gas prices lately, you're saving even more than what you see here. It drives some of that job growth. You see it on the red line, in particular with high-paying quality jobs. But more so than jobs, transit provides those crucial connections to school, to veteran centers, workforce development. Texas has the largest veteran population in the United States. Very important to connect those people as well. Texans want to be connected. They want better connectivity from their local regional service centers to, large metro areas. We want to have those connections and provide travel choices to just using your car. It's an alternative that can help mitigate congestion. We have, within the Texas Triangle, it's a very congested area. People traditionally think, well, let's just add some lanes. But what this plan is looking to do is say, we've got to move more people through these heavy corridors. And let's put transit in consideration and on the same level with those choices. Transit is a very safe mode of transportation compared to single occupancy vehicles, about a tenth the casualty rate when you use it. So when we started to develop this plan, we coalesced around a vision statement that we thought would be not only impactful, but would fit this plan. Safe, universally accessible, and integrated network of transit mobility options that connects people seamlessly, locally, and across the state, supporting an improved quality of life and a resilient and vibrant economy. So I talked a little bit about how the SMTP aligns with the state long-range transportation plan. And so we've called out 6 goal areas that map over to the SLRTP, but are curated for the SMTP. Safety and security, Mission Zero is still important for us. People who use alternatives to single occupancy modes, they want a safe and reliable network. And that's a core public transportation division mission. Asset preservation. Capital assets are getting more and more expensive. from rolling stock down to facilities, but we need to maintain those and keep them in a good state of repair so that they can meet community needs. Mobility. Having the mobility affords the opportunity to engage in all those types of trip purposes that I mentioned earlier, including those recreational opportunities that help stimulate economic development. Connectivity. So people want to be connected at a statewide level. They want to do so affordably. They want it to be easy to use and, of course, reliable. Economic vitality. So to maintain and improve the long-term competitiveness of our state and business community, transit can do that when it's a comprehensive and accessible system. Finally, stewardship. I mean, these are public funds. We need to ensure that they're being used responsibly in a multimodal approach in a way that promotes a sustainable and resilient transit network. So, why do we do the SMTP? Well, pieces of the SMTP, various planning processes, existed before, but under our Director of Modal Program, Caroline Mays, her guidance, we developed a plan that really integrated all the pieces that were separate before and put them in one package. So Texans, we need basic mobility options and a network that can accommodate those choices. I think we've heard a lot about Texas, the growth that's happening in Texas. It's not stopping anytime soon. People want options to help overcome some of those growth challenges. And then, of course, transit supports our economy. So this is a tool to help us thrive today and into the future through 2050. So this is an aspirational plan. You're not going to look at this plan and say, oh, I see specific projects with cost estimates and timeframes. No, it's an aspirational, brick foundational piece that we're starting from. I've covered these. So, no matter what scenario you look at here, we're headed north of 40 million people. I've lived in the Triangle my whole life. I've watched it get busier and busier, and I don't think that's going to abate. So like I said earlier, the challenge is to move more people through those congested corridors. Here's just a look at some of the county growth in terms of population. Obviously, the Texas Triangle is huge. 87% of the state's total population, probably it's moved up to 88%. It's easy to look at this map and think, well, that's where all the opportunities are within that Texas Triangle. Well, there are many opportunities to provide better transit service in the rural areas of our state, where people are even more dependent on those choices to get to their work sites, for their health care, for their schools. So it's a bit of a balancing act. You have increasingly urbanized areas, but those that are also losing some folks as they move to those urban areas. That's just a percent change map. Obviously, the suburbs and exurbs are growing rapidly. I'm right down there in between Austin and San Antonio, so they have a nice shade of purple. Here's transit trip maps. So approximately 277 million transit trips per year. But based on this map, you can see they're primarily concentrated in those urban and metro areas. Huge block within the Texas Triangle. Transit usage highest in the DFW area. And there's kind of the caveat that I was talking about earlier. Yes, we're urbanizing rapidly, but excuse me, within those rural areas, you have an aging population who's dependent on those services, and in some cases, a declining population. So, overview of our integrated multimodal system. In FY25, our public transportation providers carried over 234 million passengers across 252 million miles of service. We have 77 transit districts and agencies or providers. In terms of intercity bus, we have 5 private companies currently operating within the state. Intercity passenger rail, 3 Amtrak lines, which I'll show a map of later. I'm sure y'all are familiar with that. And ferries. So it may come as a surprise, but our ferry system actually carries the second largest vehicular count of cars, all part of our multimodal system. So let's look at the transit providers throughout the state. So we have 8 metropolitan transit authorities. They're primarily funded through sales tax. The state does not provide any funding to them. We have 9 large urban transit districts. There's a bit of a paradox for those large urban transit districts. You could become an MTA with local voter approval. However, once you do that, you would become ineligible for state funding. And a lot of those larger urban transit districts, most of the sales tax cap is already gone. So they can't really do it anyway. We have 24 small urban transit districts. We had a couple of new ones come online with the 2020 census. You can see Eagle Pass down there is one that came online. And we have 36 of our rural transportation transit districts. In terms of our funding relationship, TXDOT has a very strong relationship with its subrecipients in the RTDs, the small urban transit districts, and some of the large urban transit districts. We do act as a recipient for federal funds, and we also allocate some of those state funds. So this will be no shocker to y'all, but I refreshed myself before I came. Heartland Flyer, 80,000 riders. We've talked about the uncertain funding future. The Eagle and the Limited, substantial riders. And when I looked these up, you're talking double-digit increases FY 24 to 25 across the Eagle and the Limited. So common theme, increased ridership. Here's a picture of what the total transit ridership looks like in Texas, 2019 through 2025. You see a very steep decline that was related to COVID there. We had a very sharp uptick thereafter, and now we're kind of looking at a stabilization, a flattening out of that ridership. We're not quite back up to where we were before COVID, but we're headed in the right direction. So what are some of the overarching key transit needs? We do look at trip purpose. We do some surveys every now and then, usually with a partner, TTI. Primarily, people who are using it to get to employment and job centers. They're also using it for education and training, medical and healthcare, particularly important for veterans. Social and recreational activities, that might be sporting events, World Cup's coming up, tourism, and then of course personal business and day-to-day activities. But the mobility and the accessibility, we do have an aging population here in Texas, so we have to consider the needs of veterans, adults 65 and older, individuals with disabilities, of course choice riders, the ones we want to always attract, choice riders, and households that may be zero vehicle. So when we were developing the plan, we wanted to have a couple of strategies to make sure that we had really robust public engagement and involvement. First tool we used is public outreach and awareness. We conducted a number of pop-up events that might be at your local Parks and Rec building, sporting events, state fair, all sorts of farmers markets, venues to just kind of pop up there, get their attention, let them know what we're working on. We also had a steering committee that provided overall guidance during development of the plan. That was comprised of a number of stakeholders from different sized transit agencies, members of the business community, policy experts. They helped us to form our vision and provided feedback to us. We also had a substantial number of working groups that were very focused on particular issues. Some had a business focus, some had a transit district and provider focus. Those helped us to really hone in on some of the chapters within this plan. And we also did a number of public outreach events. We actually visited each district, each TXDOT district, some of them multiple times. We had good turnout, even in places where you might not expect folks to be interested. But we did get a lot of interest in those meetings. I can tell you not only in traditional transit, but there was a strong interest in passenger rail and support for active transportation modes and first last mile connections. Here's a little breakdown. So in our working group meetings, we had about 75 members across 5 committees. We had 3 rounds of engagement with them. We had 100 plus industry professionals, and we have a semi-annual transit operators meeting within the division where we gather with all of our small and urban transit districts to bring them up to speed on what's happening in the division and what's coming up on the horizon that may impact them. So we engaged them several times. We also wanted to include a strong component of MPOs and economic groups. So quite a few representatives from those, governor's office as well was involved in those to make sure we captured the planning and economic impact component of this plan. Steering committee members, there were 20 members on that committee, 5 meetings that happened over time, 23 MPO leaders. We met with them at least twice. And in the end, we were able to form a list of over 10,000 stakeholders who were interested in this plan and wanted to receive updates about where the SMTP was and what outreach events might be next. In fact, I've seen some of you here who joined me in those and received those updates. Oops. So let's talk about a little bit about what we heard when we were developing the SMTP. For service and connectivity, there was a strong demand, particularly in some of the rural areas, for greater service hours, greater frequency, greater connectivity between those rural areas and urban areas, and even getting into the MTAs. Facilities and physical assets. So sometimes, let's say you have an intercity bus facility. Well, in the past, you might have a nice multimodal building that you could use that had waiting areas. But what's happening in practice now is sometimes it's just a gas station and people are waiting outside. So people want improved waiting areas. They want improved amenities. Finally, funding and resources. It's tough to meet all the requirements of the legal and technical framework, managing your facility upgrades, and then, of course, maintaining your workforce, particularly in the rural areas or West Texas, where you have a lot of economic pressure to take those drivers away. Maybe they go work in the private sector or for larger transit providers. It's hard to find that transit employee who will be trained, retained, and stay there. So our public outreach, here's kind of a heat map. Some of those areas that look like bullseyes, we visited them 3 times. We reached over 100,000 Texans through 4 phases of outreach, over 23, 24, and 25. We held in-person events in all 25 TXDOT districts. We engaged nearly 2,200 people. We had a number of surveys throughout the plan that helped us rank our challenges, that helped define our needs, that helped shape some of our strategies. So those were quite useful to us. We also polled members of the public for implementation steps to see what they thought was first or most important to do. And I covered some of those key themes, but service development, making sure our rural providers' needs are met, talked about facilities, but improving the intercity connectivity. And a message that I've heard here today at this conference that is true on the transit side, to include passenger rail, is to be able to sell the story and show the value that transit provides to folks. Because it's one thing to talk about it or say we have a community satisfaction for this provider of X%, but when you can demonstrate it, write a story, show how it's helping individuals, it's a much more powerful message. And persistence is key. Here's a couple of comments I thought were interesting that we got from the public in regard to the plan. TXDOT should consider emerging modes in the rapid evolution of multimodal transit. True, there are a lot of technological advancements, and we are considering those. A lot of people were just happy for us to be out there talking about modes other than SOV. We need options. Tell us about them. So let's get into some of the plan organization. So before we get into this, we completed the plan at the beginning of this year, and we've got 7 chapters within our SMTP. First one's an introduction. It shows how the plan aligns within the framework of TXDOT's overall scheme of plans. We do a little dive into the state of transit today to show our ICB carriers, our transit districts, our ferries, our rail, show some of those statistics. And then these next 4 are really the key thematic areas that we took a dive into to see what the needs, gaps, and challenges were and associated strategies that might help remedy some of those. And then finally, our last chapter is called Texas Transit Forward, or what we're going to do in terms of implementation first. So in regard to those 4 chapters that I mentioned, I'm going to walk through some of these. They may be too small to see, so I'll talk through some of them. Needs, gaps, and challenges. So urban and rural area services. We know that the urban areas are growing. There's need for expanded service and hours. Transit is a tool that helps provide economic benefit. There are sectors and areas of the state that are growing that need transit service. How do you get the workers there? For instance, the space boom that's happening in Texas, well, some of those areas are very remote locations. So how do you get the workers there? Congestion, increasingly driven by growth. We've got a lot of hours in congestion and delays out throughout the state. Our rural and small urban general mobility networks. These are important networks that people use to get to their day-to-day activities, and they rely on them more than someone, say, in an MTA or a large urban might, because that might be the only link they have to get around for their service. Workforce recruitment and training, that's a challenge, particularly the smaller providers. And those were the key gaps, needs, and challenges within the urban and rural transit services chapter. Intercity connectivity and intercity connections. So people are interested in making a complete trip throughout the state, not just within the triangle, but from their rural area to an urban area and into an MTA. And they want that connectivity. They want to take those trips. We heard it. Governance. So if you look in the wonderfully engaging Texas Transportation Code, you will see that public transportation, there are 10 chapters just for rural and urban districts, transportation authorities, metropolitan transit authorities. There are a lot of chapters, but the challenge is perhaps we need a new structure that can enable statewide projects to proceed. And I don't want to speak for our rail division, but there are many chapters within administrative code, within Texas statutes as well. So there's a lot to take in there, and perhaps for intercity connectivity and overall projects, there's a new way to look at governance. Planning and design. So transit is often considered towards the back end of a project. You build a factory, you build a tech hub, but then you don't think about how we need transit until it's already built. Then how do you get the workers there? Transit resilience. I heard about Katrina earlier. We had Hurricane Harvey come through. Our coastal transit districts were impacted by that. How can we build in resilience and safety within our transit system? Another one is aligning transit development with transit supportive land uses. We have very low density development in a lot of areas, not really conducive to high volume people moving projects, I'll say. Next, this is one that is familiar. We all have a problem. There's never enough money, right? Not enough money to maintain our critical assets that we have in place today. It's hard to maintain the service that we have out there, and even to consider new service when it's a struggle day to day with maintaining what we have. Funding for new service, what programs will we get? What does a new authorization look like? And those associated challenges and constraints. So those are our needs, gaps, and challenges, our 4 main thematic chapters. Let's talk about some of the strategies. So in regard to urban and rural transit services, we're looking at identifying priority corridors and estimating minimum levels of service. So we know that throughout our rural areas and our urban providers, there are gaps in our hours of service and span of service. And we do have, within this plan, there are very high-level estimates of what it might take to start checking some of these boxes. We also strong need a strategy is to integrate transit modes and mobility options with other transportation modes, being truly multimodal, using that last active transportation first and last mile step, and of course to establish a partnerships to promote comprehensive workforce development. In terms of intercity connections, and I'll talk about this one a little bit more, I think this one has a really strong tie-in to passenger rail. But to identify a statewide route, corridor, and hub network where those kind of decisions would make sense or are needed, and then develop a governance framework for that statewide and regional intercity connectivity. Implement technology to transform seamless travel. So that's pretty wide open. Maybe it's autonomous vehicles. Maybe it's one seamless universal trip planning app. Maybe it's connected vehicles being able to talk to each other better, transit units. There are a lot of potential solutions, and it's a quickly evolving sector. In terms of planning and design, research and document the benefits that transit provides. Excuse me. So APTA has a very simplistic model that says, well, for every $1 that's spent on public transportation, it generates $4 in impact. Well, that's great, and at a high level, no problem. But if you really want to look at what's happening local, what the impact is being made, you need a better tool to do that. And sometimes it's not as easy as saying, well, we're going to measure our ridership or our cost per hour efficiency. Because some transit providers, particularly in rural areas, are never going to win on those measures. They're just not. Prioritize safety and resiliency is also a strategy. And then there's an opportunity to enhance research, reporting, and knowledge sharing across transit providers and across levels of service to learn lessons, to share potentially opportunities for collaboration. Finally, funding, maintain and expand services. So how do we maximize the available funding we have? How can we drop those silos of funding across all the programs? Expand those sources. So when we have an authorization come out, can we consolidate some of those programs? Can we curtail some of the boutique discretionary programs? It's probably better to have more formula if you're in Texas. And finally, tie funding to growth, perhaps on a per capita basis here in Texas, and performance. Are you performing well? Well, let's expand the funding. I threw this in here if you want to flip back to it and you're looking at this presentation. This is just a quick overview. I just covered it, but this aligns the needs, gaps, and challenges with the strategies and shows you our steps for implementation, which I will cover next. So our initial priority actions, this is what we're looking at that came out of the SMTP's development. What do we want to tackle first? We built the foundation, now let's knock out some of these pieces. So we're looking to establish a community of practice to address small urban and rural transit challenges. That's something that the department will lead. Develop a statewide transit network hub We'll lead that. We'll also facilitate that. Develop flexible transit planning and design guidelines. We can help facilitate that one. Developing some of those success metrics. I'm going to talk about that in a bit after this slide. But how can we broaden data collection and develop consistent reporting? Of course, identify options for flexibility in funding, new sources, innovative partnerships. How can we maintain and expand our transit network? And then finally, is telling the story. How can we expand on what transit is doing for everyday Texans and folks throughout our state? Sell those success stories. So the first step is to establish, first implementation action is to establish a community of practice to address small urban and rural transit challenges. So we've actually already started that. We kicked that off at our transit operators semi-annual meeting in Lubbock, Texas, earlier this month. And this is going to be called the Transit Peer Exchange. So what it is basically a forum for those who wish to participate. We're hoping we have strong participation because transit providers are interested in it. But how can you share resources about procurement best practices? Or perhaps you have a microtransit project that's really successful. Have you done some service branding that works? Let's get together and share those. It's about strategies that help transit districts help each other and improve what they're doing. I touched on this one. It's development of a statewide network and hub plan. Key corridors throughout the state, priority transit destinations statewide, those key hub locations between those local, regional, and then metro trips, and identifying those first and last mile connections to include active transportation modes. And then where might we need some transit treatments that improve our speed, improve our reliability, design, and that might, one of the things that we're going to do when we take a look at this network and hub plan, it's going to take a while to develop it, but we will be looking at passenger rail options in there and taking a look at those markets. That will be part of this study. The development of flexible statewide planning and transit design guidelines. Each project is unique, particularly economic projects, but hey, think about when that project exists in public right of way, how can we make it more accessible? How can we make it work more with our transit network? Let's create some common language around usage and expectations that facilitate and improve passenger experience, but also safety and accessibility. So to develop success metrics, I already talked about how there's a difference in service effectiveness and efficiency when you're looking at our systems as a whole from metro to rural areas. Let's focus on the movement of people in our projects, but let's think about metrics that can show the value transit is providing in the rural areas. How close are you to a hospital or a university? What is the perception of that transit service in your community? What is the perception of the employees who are working for that transit provider? What kind of local impact is being generated by an operator of transit? We're also looking to streamline the reporting process. NTD is kind of a complex reporting process. It's hard for a lot of the smaller systems. James is giving me the thumbs up back there, he knows. We're looking to simplify that burden. We're redesigning our PTN 128 reporting system. That should help do some of that. And updating our reporting structure, we're required to provide an annual report, the Texas Transit Statistics Report, updating that to make it more comprehensive and more impactful. Another implementation step here, how do we increase the flexibility of our funding sources and identify new ones to help maintain and expand our system? How can we knock down those silos? How can we best leverage our funding? Is that doing more group purchases of our assets? Is that having one configuration across the fleet units that we have? That's probably advocating for more formula funding, less discretionary boutique programs. So that's an initial step as well. And it's perfectly in time for legislative session and recently proposed authorization, which I was taking a look at last night. Another implementation step, formalize that plan for regular outreach on the benefits of transit. So we do have a public relations coordinator within our division, and she does try to help develop transit stories that show the impact that transit's having out in our community. But I think when we continue to build that and show people what it's doing, it really benefits not only the perception of transit, but for those who may be skeptics and think it's just empty buses and empty trains riding around, right? So that's building a robust outreach campaign. We did that extensively with this plan by using social media, traditional media, word of mouth. Next, let's talk a little bit. So I talked about, these are the 3 ones that we're currently working on. I wanted to show that, this plan is a long-range aspirational plan, and it builds upon initial implementation steps, but this is a plan that will get regular updates, and we're already working on 3 of them. I mentioned the Transit Peer Exchange, which has gotten off the ground. We are doing some work on value of transit to hopefully build a transit dashboard that really communicates that value that transit is providing. So we've started that. I expect that probably the beginning of FY27 is when we'll start development of that transit network and hub plan. I would say that's probably at least an 18-month effort. I mean, that's going to be a comprehensive look that can help build the backbone of that hub and network plan. And like I mentioned earlier, if you read the plan, it does have some high-level estimates for what it would take to this aspirational 2050 goal of transit in Texas. And they might be something that would be considered easy, like, well, let's do microtransit in 24 or 25 urban areas at $1 million a piece and see what that gets. Or it might be something like, let's get some high-speed rail between San Antonio and Austin. As someone who's lived there my whole life, I'd love to take that. That'd be great. Let's get going. But those are expensive, obviously, so we do have some of those high-level estimates. So I wanted to wrap up with just a call to action. I mean, y'all are doing great work with passenger rail. We try to do it on the transit side, but the key message is we're all about providing options to traveling alone, right? So let's get on the same page with these implementation actions and the opportunities that we'll have ahead of this session, and make transit work for everyone. Let's try to strengthen our coordination across partners and regions. The more congested we are, the more important it is for a connected, statewide, multimodal network. And that means things other than just highways. All the modes we have, let's use them. And delivering that multimodal Texas, it requires continued collaboration with our partners and a commitment, champions, who will lead that at our rural transit districts, our other partners. And what I'd like to leave you with is, how can each of us support the implementation of these priorities moving forward across all those multimodal modes? And that's all I have for y'all. Thank you. And I'm happy to take some questions.
Are we on? A question. Transit, that's a broad brush. A lot of stuff we're talking about here is inner city and commuter, but as far as transit goes, say like DART as an example. There are extensions outside of the member cities. They wanted to tie into DART possibly. Well, you don't have the ridership to really justify that kind of expense for light rail would your office be looking at how to supplement that, or would they take that undertaking, or would that still be a DART issue? Say bus rapid transit versus light rail tying in a station transfer, then go on a DART. Would that be y'all, or would that be a DART?
I don't think it's us. I think some of those regional coordination decisions occur at the regional level, and within Cap Metro, we've had some of the same thoughts that have happened around DART. Like some cities say, I don't want to participate, or maybe I do want to participate. I think some of it is selling the benefit that they're getting from that. But I do think in terms of overall governance, there's a lot of opportunity for an entity that would assist with that and think about it on a statewide level.
And another question is, how fast is your perspective changing on what's urban and what's rural? Because what was rural 5 years ago, hell, it's in the middle of downtown or along the highways. Look at Kyle and Buda or Anna and everything going towards Sherman out of Dallas along 75. It ain't what it was just a few years ago.
Absolutely. So
do you all, I mean, is that what you're trying to concentrate on, or are you still talking far west Texas out in BFE?
We have to consider both. Because when the census came out, we did have new small urbans that were formed, Eagle Pass, San Marcos, where I went to school. Like you say, in between San Antonio and Austin, it's grown tremendously, but it's a balancing act. Because as those rurals become small urbans, they unlock new opportunities and different funds. But at the same time, we have rural providers who might cover 25 counties in the Panhandle, and they don't have the urbanization. They're shrinking. So I think it's a little bit of balancing both.
Okay. Any other questions from the crowd? Were Oh, come on.
Come on, it can't be that comprehensive.
He was good, but come on.
Well, thank you very much, Theo, for the great presentation. And I'll steal some of my words for the next intro. But I think the idea of the transit network hub plan is great. You and others have talked about the great growth in North Texas, and 8 of the 15 fastest growing cities in the United States are in Texas. Many are suburbs, and they're really far away from downtown. So like the fastest growing city in the entire country is Salina, which is 1 hour north of Dallas. And have you been having any conversations with the freight railroads about additional opportunities to institute more commuter rail, regional rail type services? Because, and not to give away my secrets, but I live south of Dallas and there is no transit access. And if I wanted to drive to DART light rail, it's 27, 28 minutes. And if I just drive to the office, it's 35. So, there's not much transit service to the south. I'll just stay in my car. But if you had commuter rail running on the BN Railroad, down to Cedar Hill, which has a population of approaching 70,000, I might decide to leave my car there where there's shopping and all other activities and take commuter rail right into downtown. So
I think there is definitely an opportunity for that. And I think when we're doing this network and hub plan, we will try to identify some of those connections, because it's not only about existing connections that make sense today because there are facilities. It is about identifying some of those new connections and how there might be local circulators or smaller service that would feed in to get you there to make that complete trip. So that is something we will take a look when we're developing the network and hub plan.
great, thank you.
All right, just to keep us all on time, I want to say thank you to you, Theo, and appreciate your presentation. And anybody else have questions for him, catch him before he exits the building.
Thank you all very much.